most likely won't make a Mania review because it's just gonna be really hard to review, you know? Sonic Superstars review will not be coming anytime soon. I'm just gonna... Yeah, I know I said I wouldn't be doing a Sonic Superstars review anytime soon. That was because I thought that I should move on from the classics after Sonic CD. I tried doing that by reviewing Shattered Generations, and that couldn't have gone any worse than it did. I then made a poll, and the results are pretty obvious. So, before we actually have nothing else to review when it comes to the classic Sonic era, let's review Sonic Superstars, the latest classic Sonic game. We start off with Bridge Island Zone, which is a totally new zone we've never seen before. Yeah, sure. But to be completely honest, Bridge Island is one of the best zones in Sonic Superstars. It has extremely great flow, introduces the player to the new level design and gimmicks, and actually has good bosses. This might be a bit confusing to say, especially since the mini-boss of the zone is just you running away from the boss, meaning no fighting actually happens, and the first main boss is just a way for you to test out the emerald powers. Considering what we have coming up, that's probably more of a good thing than you may think. The only real problem I have with Bridge Island is the fact that the giant rings are a little easy to find. I do know that it's the first zone in the game, and considering how easy it is to find giant rings in Angel Island, you'd think this would be a non-issue. But in Angel Island, giant rings were behind rocks and hidden to some extent, not just out in the open. All in all though, a great zone. Good music, nice visuals, not horrible boss fight, and very easy level design, as one would expect. Next up, we have Speed Jungle, easily the best zone in Sonic Superstars. And the main reason why is due to the flow the level has. When you're sliding down the vines, you're not stopping at all, dodging obstacles and jumping to clear roadblocks that would have killed your momentum, it's the pinnacle of Sonic Superstars gameplay. The environment is also really cool, somehow distinguishing itself from Jungle Zone while also being reminiscent. But that's nothing compared to its music. This is the best music in the game, which is kind of concerning for the overall quality of Sonic Superstars. Unlike Bridge Island, the giant rings are better, and take some level of intelligence to find. This is also where we get introduced to character-specific zones, and lo and behold, the first one in the game is also the best. It just takes what was already a good idea for the zone and cranks it up to 11. With Fang chasing you, and drop dashing down the vines is always super fun to do. And when it comes to the bosses, well, they're manageable. The mini-boss is fine. I think it has absolutely nothing to do with the jungle theming unlike Bridge Island, but there's really nothing wrong with it. But the boss itself is probably where things start to go downhill. You can't damage it, and attacks are all things you need to be ready for, meaning reacting to them can a lot of the time be impossible. It's still not a bad boss, just the worst one yet. Wow, this is actually going pretty well. Bridge Island and Speed Jungle are two zones I actually like. Too bad the third one is also pretty good. Yes, for the first time in Carnival's silent history, there's actually a time where the first three zones of a game are all good in my eyes. Sky Temple is definitely more of a stretch than the first two, but it's definitely not bad at all. Firstly, the music isn't exactly something I'm a fan of unlike the other two zones, but it definitely is better than some of the later zones in the game, so it gets a pass because believe me when I say, the music in the zones get much worse. Another iffy thing about Sky Temple Zone is the level design, especially the later parts of the zone. To be honest, it's kinda confusing, when I wasn't even able to do it normally, but with the bullet ability it wasn't too hard. On the complete flip side, almost everything else is really cool. I love the environment of the zone, little things like the cloud enemy are also a nice touch, and the gimmicks are really kind as well. But the boss is also something I dislike. I definitely feel like this one is more of a skill issue than me actually having real criticism for it, but the idea wasn't executed very well, and I feel a lot of attacks either need to be known when they happen, or are just straight up impossible to dodge. So, we've done 3 good zones in a row, do you think we can do 4? No, we couldn't go 4 zones in a row. Next up, we have Pinball Carnival Zone, and this is where things start to get a bit more in the negative category of zones. But this is just the beginning of the bad segments, so there are some really amazing aspects that I like about this level. For example, a lot of the gimmicks in the zone are actually really cool, some being in concept only, like the red and blue flames, and some in concept and execution, like the roller coasters that show up in Act 2. Another thing that is good is the bosses. These not only have really cool visual designs, but is also better than the bosses from Speed Jungle. But on the opposite end, the music is extremely bland, the level design is either utilizing gimmicks horribly like the fire, or just straight up annoying to play, like having areas only accessible by very specific bounces, which, for the 4th zone of a 12 zone game, is just extremely unnecessary. The visuals of the zone are standard for the themed levels with similar aesthetics, and the Tails Doll cameo is pretty cool, but this is definitely where zones of the game start scoring below a 6 out of 10. Not even kidding, this has to be one of the most confusing zones I've ever played. Lagoon City Zone does so many good things, you'd think it's the best zone in the game, but it does so much bad that you'd think it's the worst. For example, along with Speed Jungle, this zone has some of the best music in the entire game. It fits the water theme perfectly, and is also a very enjoyable track overall. The giant ring placements are also really good. I must say that unlike the average Sonic zone, going up doesn't mean you instantly find the entrances to the special stage. And the level design is also extremely well made, with huge slides that are a lot more fun than other water levels. But actually, level design isn't always so good in Lagoon City. When underwater, the game doesn't just feel slow, it feels boring. There's nothing to avoid, there's nothing to look forward to, and I have no idea why they thought the bubble gimmick was a good idea to bring from Mania. Thankfully, you can actually skip a lot of the water in this zone. Another bad thing that Lagoon City has are its bosses. The mini-boss isn't that bad, having an electric boss in a water zone is actually kind of original from classic Sonic, but I feel like the boss lacks any sort of vibe. It kind of just feels like, oh, it's a mini-boss, and not something like, that mini-boss was really cool. Overall, it has a decent concept, but a really bad execution. But the boss is really where the main complaint of Sonic Superstars starts to shine. In case you haven't already noticed, the main thing that people can objectively point to when it comes to the negatives of Sonic Superstars are the grueling bosses, and Lagoon City is no exception. Sometimes when a platform is meant to rise, it just doesn't, and some sections drag on for no good reason. The final section took me a long time to understand, and I always felt that throughout the fight, there were always 10-second sections where I had nothing but fear confusion throughout it. Overall, it's a below average zone at worst and mid at best, but trust me, things are about to get a lot worse. Well, we've made it. Welcome to the beginning of what I can safely call bad zones from Sonic Superstars. So, how are we starting this off? Already, we plunge into one of my least favorite zones. Unlike levels like Speed Jungle and Lagoon City, which are partially inspired by Jungle Zone from the Sonic 1 Master System and Hydro City from Sonic 3, Sad Sanctuary just doesn't have a shred of originality in it. It also starts the trend where giant rings are no longer difficult to get and require skill, and where they just start being annoying to get. I personally don't have a good track record with sand-themed areas, but this is especially bad, and the level design overall, with its carelessly placed enemies and unexciting gimmicks, is just horrible. To be completely honest, however, the music is pretty good, but that should be a given considering who composed it, and that doesn't really help much when you consider that we still haven't even talked about the worst part of the level. I don't think I have ever played such an infuriating boss fight in my entire life up until this point. It takes Lagoon City's confusion with horribly long cycles, and if you don't know what you're doing, heck, even if you do know what you're doing, the boss will most likely take most time to beat, and it will take longer than the time you actually took to beat the level. Alright, so saying Sanctuary, what I already consider to be a bad zone in the game. I wonder what's next. Oh, come on. I'm not even gonna try to introduce any aspect of this level, because this level literally doesn't do a single thing right. And that's not even an exaggeration. Press Factory is hands down the worst zone in the entire game. And considering what's after this, I'm surprised that's even a possibility. To start off, the level design is absolutely abysmal. Think of Scrap Brain Zone from Sonic 1, but with even more annoying objects and a very stupid gimmick that makes you lose control for no apparent reason. Yes, you can see in the background for when exactly it's going to push you upwards, but really think about that. In order for me to properly use an already bad gimmick, The way I have to use it is for me to look at the background. It doesn't help that you just don't roll into a ball, so if you're next to an enemy and you suddenly get catapulted upwards, well, that's your problem. And Act 2 has it even worse, with a multitude of crushing walls that appear for no reason other than to make the level more annoying and take longer to get through, like Scrap Brain, and having an even worse gimmick that'll kill you if you don't hit buttons in time. Another aspect of this level I hate is the horrendous music. Like, I'm genuinely surprised by what happened here. We go from Sand Sanctuary, a track I don't necessarily think of as the best, to one of the worst tracks from any Sonic game I have ever heard. There's really nothing to say about it. The visuals of the level are not bad by definition. The second act background is one of my favorites, but that doesn't help the level nearly as much as more innovative levels like Quaz Quadrant in terms of visuals. And the last thing is the two really annoying bosses this level has. The mini-boss doesn't have many offenses, the attacks are understandable and you won't get unfairly hit unless you're not paying attention. But as with every Superstars boss, this also drags on way longer than it should with its long attack cycles. Because of how annoying it gets, it feels a lot more like you're just fighting to stay alive, because if you don't move in time for the hammer, that's an insta-kill. If you get under the platforms, that's also an instant kill. I just can't bring myself to understand why this level needs to be so punishing for no good reason. Overall, definitely a top contender for the worst zone in classic Sonic, but I do think Scrap Brain is still worse in most aspects. After that absolute wreck of a level, we have another zone which is overall a bad one in my opinion, but it's inconsistent that it's honestly shocking to me. For example, the level design is good. It's not great or perfect at all, but I'm taking what I can get. Rings are abundant and it always feels nice to have a lot of them at hand, and all the gimmicks are also really well thought out. Also, visually this is probably the best level in the game just because of how well the colors match together, and the design is really cool. Plus, what do you expect? It has a connection to Sonic 1, of course I'm gonna have something good to say about it. But on the complete opposite end, the boss fights are some of the worst in the game. Not a surprise, classic Sonic doesn't really have a good track record when it comes to bosses in general, and Superstars itself clearly isn't in the conversation of good bosses, but I feel I really need to emphasize this. The mini-boss, it's actually pretty okay. I do think being left with at least 3 rings at the start could have been done, since getting one shot if you don't know what's going on could be annoying, but you have plenty of time to understand, and even if you don't, running away and accessing the situation is also a possible option. Plus, the whole theme of this zone is getting a lot of rings. Having the mini-boss be a metallic piggy bank is some of the most creative things I've seen from a classic Sonic game. But unfortunately, I don't have those same pleasantries for the actual boss of the game. Because it's the second worst boss. This boss fight is literally just flat out annoying for no real reason. There's literally no purpose why Golden Capital's boss should be so much more harder and annoying than any other normal boss in the game. And that's because a lot of the problems that the boss has aren't even the boss's fault. For one, the camera in these base sections could not be more infuriating. Trying to collect a ring or two after a stressful fight only for you to get hit by a geyser of fire that you could have never seen coming is just bad game design. If you lose your rings during the fight, that's your fault, and until Fang goes into a base section, I guess you just gotta figure it out. And that's even if there is a base part, because after the upgrade, if you have no rings, then you're screwed and you have to clutch it up for the whole rest of the fight. I don't really understand why there's a lack of rings in the first section before the upgrade, but at least in that situations, there's rings to look forward to. In the second part, I believe they should have put rings, even if it's just 3 or 4. The boss doesn't really suffer from it and they don't have to start all the way back from the beginning of the fight. Overall, Golden Capital is just average. Great visuals, level design and music, but horrible boss fights that drive me crazy. I'm not gonna lie, when this zone was shown for the trailer in the game, I was actually pretty hyped for it. I thought it'd be really cool to play this zone, and honestly, I don't have any idea why I put such expectations on the zone in particular. Not to worry though, this zone did disappoint me, but that's not necessarily a bad thing for the zone. Since I set some pretty high expectations for Cyber Station, and I've had time to lower those expectations, I feel it's actually quite a decent level. I really like this pixelated style that the zone goes for, and the level design, while definitely not being of the best, is definitely not offensive in any way. The music is also pretty good, nothing like Lagoon City or Speed Jungle, but it fits the theming of the level properly and doesn't use any annoying instruments. The boss is definitely my favorite part of the zone though, because of the actual difficulty. I'm not going to deny it, I actually died a lot during this fight. But unlike a lot of the Superstars boss fights, every time I lose, I always feel it's because I wasn't paying attention or I wasn't looking ahead, not because the boss was going on for 5.5 minutes and I really wasn't going to survive anyway. Overall, I actually like this zone, which is rare when it comes to the second half of the game. Okay, but seriously, what even is this zone? Like, I'm genuinely not kidding. Does anybody have any memory of playing this zone at all? This zone is probably one of the most boring and forgettable zones in the game, and that's not even because it doesn't have any offenses to it. For one, the entire second act of the zone should be a thing on its own. I have no idea what Sonic teams deal with having a completely good setup for a boss and just replacing it with shoot. And other than that, the actual second act isn't even really an act, and it would have been a lot better if there was an actual level before the shooter section, even if it was shorter. The music is also extremely mediocre, the staple for Sonic Superstars music. It's not some horrible track, but I really wonder what happened because comparing the two halves of the game is like day and night. And Act 1, it's fine. I definitely don't have any problem with it aside from some crushing objects, and the conveyor belt gimmick is pretty cool. It's just that while it doesn't have any notable problems with it, it also doesn't strive for anything better than the normal decent level. And the last thing I want to comment on when it comes to Frozen Base is the mini-boss, because it's pretty cool. Yeah, beforehand I'd heard this boss was extremely tricky and frustrating, but in my run-through I didn't die once. Plus, I do think that having a boss fight that has Sonic running constantly is pretty cool. Overall, a decent Act 1 that got completely destroyed by a nuisance of an Act 2. Now, I wouldn't say I particularly like this level, but I really do like what it was going for. Obviously, there are some glaring issues, like how anytime you're in a crushing platform section, you need to slow down so that the reverse version can happen properly. There's the unfair enemy placements and the slow anti-gravity sections. But I like that while all of these things are genuinely things that I see wrong with the gimmicks of the level, it doesn't necessarily make it bad. Other than that, the level design is pretty standard stuff. It's also really cool that the level design was made specifically in mind so that you could do it in reverse for Act 2. Personally, I think Sonic team just didn't want to make more level design, but I think I'm happier this way. The visuals, even though it's something we've seen plenty of times, is still really wait a second. Is that the end from Sonic Frontiers? Sorry. What I meant to say is that Egg Fortress's background is easily the best background in the entire game and completely overthrows the others. So it seems the final zone of the game is pretty decent. But that's until we get into the final boss fight. I'm not even gonna sugarcoat it or even try to ease into it. Sonic Superstars' final boss is by far the worst thing I've ever played, and it isn't close. To get into perspective how unnecessarily difficult the final boss of this game is, my recording session containing the last 3 zones of the game is 90 minutes in total. And 50 minutes of that is just me trying to beat this dumb boss over and over again. I'm not trying to say that now that I beat it, I can understand its difficulty and how it's okay. Because honestly, the lack of communications in some parts, just not knowing what to do or where to do it, the lack of reaction time to something you've never seen before, and the sheer amount of time this boss takes is enough for me to deem it beyond any type of redemption. I don't know how in somebody's right mind would this be the final boss in the game. In fact, I know nobody in their right minds would make this the final boss. You know why? Because this literally isn't the final boss! Does anybody remember when it was announced that Sonic Superstars would be 24 hours long? When I heard that, I was convinced it was some sort of joke, but looking at it play out now, it's just brutal. You're telling me that even though I legitimately just finished beating that horrible boss and beating the game, I need to do all of that again with a slightly better final boss and some horrible asset usage as a sorry excuse for that difficulty? And Matt Has No Cut to Superstars video, he said something that I actually really agree with. He said that Trip's story should have been optional, and this would have made it so that people who like to have an extra challenge can pick it up, while the less intrigued players can move straight to the final boss. So yes, Trip's story is literally the same as Sonic's, just worse and even harder. So I'll pass on that. There's no way I'm playing this game anymore than I need to. So because this is the exact same playthrough of the game, just made it even more annoying to beat than it already was, there's really not much to talk about, except for one key difference. Instead of fighting Eggman as the final boss of the game, you fight Fang instead, and it's just a bit better than the Eggman boss. This isn't because they added rings to the boss so that it would be manageable, or added checkpoints in, or really all that much. Heck, some even really dumb moves like the one where Fang raises up a platform, then he bashes his head into it is also here, and that's arguably worse than the Eggman boss. The thing that makes it better is the phases. In the Eggman boss, phase 1 was the phase where he threw those blue rockets and built the floor around, and you could see his entire mech. In phase 2, you can't see all of it and the ground becomes more of an important aspect. But in Fang's fight, his phase 1 isn't the same as Eggman's phase 1. He's still in the Golden Capital mech and his attacks are more manageable, despite some of them being complete insta-kills. and when Fang does enter his second phase, it is very similar to Eggman's first phase, making the boss in itself be a bit easier than the final fight in the original story. Normally I might start saying that, oh, it's not original, it's not innovative, but honestly, at this point, I don't think that's the main issue. So yes, Trip's story is overall even worse than original Superstars. So after 2 playthroughs of the game, we finally reach the actual final boss of the game, and it's a dragon. Huh. Now, I don't know what kind of crazy context clues you would need to possibly actually see this coming or even how it makes sense, but I digress. It's a boss, so let's play it. So how do I feel about the final boss of the game? Well, I'm actually quite surprised that this fight is a lot better than the other 2 final bosses. It certainly isn't any Doomsday Zone or Egg Reverie, but with the Eggman and Fang bosses in mind, this one doesn't do anything all that bad. You fly around, collecting rings, dodging attacks, and hitting the boss. It's alright. Obviously, there's a one problem where the attack patterns are extremely slow, which makes the boss drag on for a lot longer than it needs to, but in all honesty, that's a problem for almost every boss now, so there's no point really calling it out. And after beating the boss fight and Trip using evil containment to seal the dragon away for the rest of time, we come to the end of the game. And that's Sonic Superstars, what I think will be the actual final game I'll be reviewing from the classic Sonic games. Sonic Mania might be a possibility. That depends on the feedback I receive for this video, as well as for the next video after the special video I have planned. I did see that leaving the classic Sonic era entirely didn't go so well, so I'm really starting to wonder if I should stray away from the reviews. I do still want to, but judging from what happened, I think it's possible that would be a bad idea. Do I start a super long review of the entirety of Sonic Adventure, or do I maybe even move toward the 8-bit games? I'm not sure, but I'm sure I'll figure it out. Either way, if you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe. If you want to see a playlist of all of the reviews I've done, they're in the description. And have a good day or night wherever you are.